The Athletic.
Hello and welcome to the tifo Football Podcast. I'm John McKenzie and I'm joined as ever by my good friend and producer Mike Zimmerman. Mike, how are you doing?
I'm doing good. We're getting ready for the new Premier League season.
We are, and the transfer window is being wild, so I know you've been being kept busy with that, but we do not talk about the transfer window in this episode, listeners, do not fear. We're going to talk about tactics, which is my great love, and I was lucky enough to be joined today by Liam Tharm, who's one of the tactics writers at The Athletic, for us to just have a long old chat about what we expect the tactical evolutions of next season to look like. So Mike, you caught the conversation. What did you make of it?
My favorite part was the talk about the 3-4-3 shape, also known as the box midfield, and kind of that new progression into teams playing like that. But then also on the flip side, how do teams start defending that? If that's going to be a trend going forward this season, more clubs playing that 3-box-3. How then do you counter that? And I thought you and Liam had a fantastic conversation about that.
Yeah, and there's plenty of other stuff in there that we talked about along the way. We talked about the rise of long ball football. We talked about hybrid pressing. We talked about positional versus relational ideas as well. So there's plenty of things to get into there. And I think the best thing for us to do is to just jump straight into the conversation. So it's that time of the year where everyone is doing previews of the upcoming season. But in this episode, I want us to focus on bigger picture stuff and think about what we might be seeing happening this season from a tactical point of view in particular. So to help me with this, I'm joined by a colleague, an expert, and dare I even say it, a friend. It's Liam Tharm, who is one of The Athletic's tactics writers. Liam, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. I hope the friend part applies. I'd like to think it does.
I'd like to think it does too, but it's the beginning of a new season. Are you looking forward to things?
Yeah, I am now. I think last season felt it stretched on quite a while because it did stretch on quite a while. But yeah, after having a nice summer break and very much enjoying a lot of the Women's World Cup stuff this summer, I think I'm very much in all systems go now for 2023-24.
So we're going to split this episode into two parts. We're going to spend some time talking about the tactical trends of the last few seasons and think about how we're going to anticipate these trends evolving in the near future. But then we'll end by talking about some of the teams around the world that we're excited about watching this season from a tactical point of view as well. So let's jump in with that first part, because I think one of the most interesting things about tactics is that there is that evolutionary element to it. Tactics emerge because teams respond to what's been happening earlier. So I think that what we should do is we should go back and have a look at some of the trends that have cropped up in recent seasons and start thinking about ways that we might see coaches thinking about how they're going to respond to those in the near future. So the first thing I've got down on my list is box midfields, because we put out a call for questions to the general public. One of the biggest topics that they wanted us to talk about was box midfields. So we've got a question from Kataru Kubayashi, who says, please discuss people's obsession with the box midfield. So box midfields are everywhere. But let's start off with the basics, Liam. What is a box midfield and what are they for?
Yeah, they've sort of undergone a slight change, or I think it's just become broader and more loose. So the way that I always viewed it was two defensive midfielders, and it becomes more of a role thing than it does necessarily fixed shape. But two defensive midfielders, generally behind two number 10s or two advanced midfielders, whatever you want to call them, on a very sort of fundamental split that you've got two deeper midfielders that are generally tasked with more in possession, sort of build up things, playing deep closer to their own goal, and two of your more creative talent sort of further forward, generally that get played in a system with wing backs where these two advanced number 10s or advanced playmakers want to play between the lines and closer to goal to be your creative outlets in the team. Effectively imagine sort of when everyone sort of had wingers, now they've just come increasingly more and more inside, all the way inside now to being these sort of central players.
So the classic example, I think, is probably Thomas Tuchel's Chelsea, who were playing like that, which, they had two central midfielders in a 3-4-3, and then the two wide players in the forward line would come inside, giving space for the wing-backs to push up, but also forming that box in the midfield. So the emergence there, I think, is a sort of natural one. If you're wanting to get your wide players into the middle, you're giving a little bit of backup from those central midfielders to allow those wide players to go forward without having to worry about covering the space in behind. Why do you think they emerged as a general concept, these box midfields? Is it mainly just because you're getting an overload in the middle with other teams playing three-man midfields?
Yeah, I guess it's off the back end of that. I think it's also important to remember that over the past few decades, because of course I'm well aware this is a shape or has roots in the old WM that was played sort of in the 50s and the 60s, but it might be the same sort of organisation of players, but in a much more controlled, systematic game where you aren't getting the goals per game rate that you were getting in the 50s and the 60s. Defences are tighter, more organised, more compact blocks. So I think coaches now and teams want more control in the centre of the pitch, because that will always and has always been the most valuable part of the pitch. But it's become a case that I think, I can't speak too far, prior to the 2000s, because I simply wasn't alive and didn't watch a lot of the football then. But the wings feel like they became the important area because that's where the space was, because teams would say let's congest centrally, so then fullbacks and wingers and inverted wingers became valuable because they could exploit that space. And now I think teams put more focus and more effort on putting traps into pressing in wide areas. You can't just carve through the middle of a team, so you go, okay, we're going to need another body now because the space isn't there anymore for someone to dribble through, or to, people are just going to get marked easily, so we need another body, as you say. And then that will also have the repercussion of, if they get marked, there'll be more space out wide or space elsewhere.
It definitely does feel as though the trend has been to try and build up through the middle. Obviously, that's because the goal is in the middle, right? And what we've been seeing more of lately, I think, is teams just trying to block out the centre of the field. So we've just had the Community Shield game between Arsenal and Manchester City where both teams were doing that. And I guess the idea there is that, okay, you're allowing space in the wider areas, but it's much harder to exploit that space as well. Do you think that we're going to start seeing a movement back towards trying to exploit space in wide areas?
Absolutely. I think particularly now, so we were speaking about the box midfield, that the thing that's become popular, and I write about this if people want to see it in the end of season tactical trends, that I don't think I've seen a trend be so sort of homogenous in like the big top teams doing it, and sort of Arsenal, City and Liverpool moving a fullback into midfield to sort of be that creative outlet, that creative player, which I guess makes sense because often central midfield and fullback rotations are some of the most common ones. So I guess it's just been more commonly pushing a fullback on into an advanced area in recent seasons, and it's been then the central midfielder that's been dropping out. And this is then kind of, it's a different style. It's going the opposite way, I suppose. But it was really fascinating because there were, and it's not a perfect metric, but there were 84 fullback assists last season, which was lower in all of the 4 seasons combined. In 3 of those seasons, they had over 100. So it feels like we've really gone through that peak of Trent, of Robertson, of wide crosses or crosses from the half space and then big set piece threats, to now, okay, we want you to be technical, creative control players. And of course that does then mean there's going to be space for particularly, I think, bottom half teams that often have a lot of good direct attacking wingers. I'm aware that a lot of the top teams do as well, but they just don't seem to want to play in transition as much anymore. I think there's times where they will do out of necessity and in big games, but it feels like it's massively, like for Pep now, massively sort of a plan B of we're prepared to do it if we need to, and even then we don't really like doing it, but it's out of necessity. Liverpool seem to want to move away from that sort of transitional system, which is fair enough, but that's still going to be a threat that a lot of bottom teams have, and it makes sense if you're leaving space in those wide areas, teams are going to exploit it.
It's interesting you mentioned Liverpool there, because there's an extent to which Manchester City, Arsenal are they're more in the same sort of tactical genre as one another. Liverpool, as you say, haven't been in that genre, and it's been interesting to see them experimenting with those sorts of ideas at the end of last season, largely because I guess the personnel they had didn't allow them to play the more traditional Klopp tactics. But why do you think that Liverpool were impelled to make those sorts of changes? Do you think it's just the fact that the season has sort of fallen away so much, they just had the freedom to be able to just experiment? And do you see them carrying on with those sorts of tactics going forward?
Yeah, partly. I think we make a mistake sometimes of forgetting that, like, I don't think coaches ever truly want to play like a set system or a set way. They might have an idea of how they like football, but like any good coach, and of course these top level Premier League coaches are the best around, are going to play a system that best suits the players that they have. And then you look at as players either age or they change or players leave. I think Mane leaving was one of the biggest things that happened in terms of maybe catalysing that, and we didn't quite notice at the time. We went, oh, it's going to impact their press, but we assumed that they could just get in a like-for-like replacement, or we saw similar players in someone like Nunez or Luis Diaz or Jota that could come in and act as that replacement. So I think it's just a way that the players are changing and that the style, at times I think coaches go, well, we need to eventually change something and evolve something in order to sort of move. And as you say, out of necessity sometimes when things do start going badly, I guess you do maybe get stuck in that loop of, okay, maybe what we're doing, you then have to decipher, is the idea wrong or is the execution purely wrong? And I also think that what is difficult is that transition is normally quite a reactive game. You can find good ways to, force it and make it repeatable through setting traps or defending in a certain way, or having certain pressing targets. But you are still relying on the opposition having the ball first and then winning it and doing something with it, or counter-pressing a set way from when you're losing it. And I think there's that tiny bit too much chaos for a lot of the modern managers now, I think, where they say, we want to win and we want to win with a certain style, and when I can do it with a way that almost means, because we're going to control the ball, you can change your position to be whoever you want to be. It doesn't matter, because if we're going to have the ball and play our way, then we'll find the solutions regardless of how they're sort of set up to defend.
So we've already mentioned Thomas Tuchel's 3-4-3 shape, which naturally ended up with a box midfield, but you've also alluded to the fact that a lot of teams will form a box midfield by moving a player, and that's generally been a fullback inverting. So that's a fullback moving inside and sitting alongside another pivot player, and then having your 2 8s being then able to push forward a little bit further with that extra defensive cover. But I think there's been plenty of other different ways that you can form box midfield, so we'll talk a little bit about that now. But we did have a question from Sean Nielsen on Twitter. He's wanted us to talk about the phenomenon of fullbacks tucking in and shifting back four and midfield, a la Zinchenko at Arsenal now. How, why, here to stay, or tactical trend? And obviously this, I think, fits in with the big question about box midfield. So let's start off by talking about inverted fullbacks, because I think there's been a few interesting things that have happened this season in terms of inverted fullbacks, and I think maybe the way that I would typify that is by talking again about Liverpool, because what we saw from Liverpool towards the end of the season, I think around the last 10 games, was Jurgen Klopp allowing Trent Alexander-Arnold to invert, go inside, sit alongside the 6 and do, nominally form that box midfield. But it felt quite different to the sorts of things that, Sean himself references Zinchenko at Arsenal, right? Which is, you take a left back in Zinchenko, move him inside, gives you an extra player in the middle, allows you to do central build up if that's what you want to do, and that seems to be the general idea with moving that player inside, because it does give you that overload. It does allow you to build up through the middle, which, as we've already said, is the most dangerous part of the pitch to attack the opposition goal. Also gives you a little bit of defensive solidity as well in transition moments if you lose the ball. But with Trent Alexander-Arnold, I think it was slightly different, because with most inverting fullbacks, you want them to be able to play as pivots who can pin opposition players, right? Which is the idea being that you get inside their block, you squeeze the opposition's defensive block a little bit narrower, and you have players who can receive the ball with their backs to goal, can take the ball on the turn, and can actually progress the ball through lines of pressure in those central areas. And what we've seen a little bit more, I think, this season is maybe players who aren't able to really do that back to goal pinning stuff being moved inside as well. So I think Alexander-Arnold is a really good example of that. And I'll throw it over to you just for your thoughts on the difference between Trent Alexander-Arnold playing in possession in a wide place, a wide area, and then him playing central. What do you think the reason for that move was?
I think that's obviously got a lot to do with his sort of distribution and his long-range passing ability, which, in all fairness, he sort of completely proved me wrong with. It's something that I said, and to be fair, I think it still largely holds water in terms of bigger games against better pressing teams, that I just think his spatial awareness is probably one of the biggest flaws in his game. And of course, that is less problematic when you're out wide and you can have the full view of the pitch. You can see where the pressure's coming from at all angles. Of course, you need to be a better scanner if you're in midfield, because your back's going to be to goal more. You need to be able to check your shoulders and then obviously see pitches quickly, to hold them in your brain and then act upon them. Again, we're talking sort of milliseconds, but those are key differences between a player, seeing the right picture, making the right turn, making the right pass. But I will say that he does suit, particularly when teams are going to sit off in more of a middle or a low block, that he's one of, if not the best long passers in the world. And that is a range of passes, of a driven crossfield ball, that can be a curl pass in behind, that can be a cross from deep. So he's effectively just a player that provides solutions in terms of a final ball. So that for me makes perfect sense, and that is one of the two reasons why I see, along with players then coming inside in order to pin a player. There was a fantastic clip, I don't know if you saw it, from Zinchenko, I think it was sort of last week, did the rounds on social media from part of a wider interview he did, and he's talking about how when he moves inside, he thinks his job is done if the winger comes with him, fundamentally because he's saying when he plays on the left and he comes into midfield, if he pulls the right winger out or whoever's playing on the right hand side, he goes, then Bakara's 1v1, and suddenly you've got an angle from the centre-back to pass to the winger 1v1 all the time, and it just increases the number of opportunities you can get for that winger to attack. And I think it's increasingly important because you see lots of teams, and Arsenal now I guess are going to suffer from the success of being good, in that people are going to double up on their wingers all the time, particularly in a low block when you've got your back four, your back five deep. You'll then get a central midfielder or a winger out, and Saka or Martinelli end up 1v2. It's massively more difficult, and it's just a way, as we often say, sort of build up is about finding solutions to problems. That is finding a solution to a problem there that exists when you can get your winger attacking the fullback higher up the pitch in 1v1 more often.
Yeah, and that's in part what we mean when we say pinning, right? It means pulling the opposition player who is nominally responsible for marking you into a different area so that it opens up other options. So by Zinchenko going inside, pulling his marking winger with him, that's going to open up that angle, as you say, to the left winger in that instance. But I think, yeah, the move with Alexander-Arnold inside is interesting because to me, I mean, I think that Liverpool did that in order to try and replicate the sorts of ideas that teams like Arsenal, Man City are implementing with that concept of, dragging the opposition block narrower to give you better access in the wide areas. But there's a lot of things about the Liverpool approach that didn't really work with it. One of them is that when you play that way, when you pin the opposition midfield narrow, what it allows you to do, as you said, is give you better access into the wide players. But usually that means the wide player has to drop to make the pass workable, and that means you're getting someone like Mohamed Salah dropping inside down the channel to receive to feet, and that's we all know that Mohamed Salah is a player who likes to get in behind, facing the goal, running on those diagonal lines. And I think one of the things we saw from Liverpool to solve that problem the part of the problem is that you're just getting Salah away from the areas where he's really dangerous, right? You don't want to do that as a coach. One of the solutions that they used was by having the eights, the Liverpool eights, move out and offer the width instead of the forwards as well. So for me, that was one of the reasons why the system didn't really work, because from a pinning point of view, it doesn't really suit the sort of players that Liverpool have. But I do really like the idea of actually getting Alexander-Arnold inside from the point of view, as you said, if it just opens up a huge range of passing options. If you're playing as a fullback, the options available to you are play the ball, down the line, or play a crossfield ball, or play inside to a central midfielder. As soon as he's moving inside, suddenly he has the option of playing those penetrative passes through the middle as well, which is something that Liverpool were missing as well. And so I think that's been a bit of a tactical evolution that we saw even last season. The idea of having an inverted fullback who's not actually doing the positional pinning stuff that we know that Pep Guardiola and Mikel Arteta want to do, but this different role. And I read a piece recently by Lorcan Rees who calls this role the pendulum pivot. So this idea that you're going to invert the fullback, but rather than getting them inside the opposition block, you're going to have them sitting outside, so they can still receive the ball facing down the field. They're still going to be able to have all of the upside that they offer when they're in possession, but in such a way that they don't have to be really good press-resistant midfielder options as well. So Arsenal did that in the pre-season when they played against Nuremberg, using Kivior on the left-hand side, and he was coming inside, but rather than doing what Zinchenko's doing and trying to drag wingers with him and get inside the block and make that block narrow, he's actually sitting outside the block so he can receive ball to feet and progress the ball there. And I think that's an interesting concept as well when you consider that Arsenal have signed Declan Rice, who is, again, another one of those players who isn't really elite in terms of receiving the ball back to goal. He actually is much better when he receives facing the opposition goal, and I think that could be a solution that we're going to start seeing, especially now that as the news is coming out, we're seeing all of these midfielders now who are being brought in across the Premier League, but we're talking about physical midfielders now who are going to be good ball carriers, and don't have the sort of usual on-ball technical ability to be able to play as that kind of pivot player. So I've just said a lot of things there. You must have some thoughts about some of the ideas.
No, I agree with Rice 100%. I thought some of his best moments in the first half of that Community Shield in possession were pulling out wide on the left and being parts of those rotations there to push Timber on and to just sort of connect play through that way. So again, as I think I sort of mentioned at the start, that there's lots of overlap in terms of how it can look in terms of what teams are doing, but the reality is they're all doing it in very different ways, and that's also because if you compared even Arsenal and City further on up the field, that they've got very different types of number 9s, for instance, or they've got wingers who are going to play in sort of very different ways, even if they're both playing nominally a number 9 and a left-footed right winger and a right-footed left winger. It's just entirely different, and it's down to the coaches, which obviously is going to sound silly, but they're maximising the players that they have. And it's not a case of we're playing this because I want it to look in this set way. It's a case of organising the jigsaw piece, if you will, into a way that best fits. And I think Spurs are now an interesting example of that as well. I actually went to their pre-season game against Shakhtar, and it starts to reach an interesting point in terms of it can get players into effective positions, but it's a case of who do you want on the ball in which areas, because I thought it really suited Destiny Udogie off the left. He's a right-footed, was a wing-back at Udinese on loan, but really, really good forward runner, really good underlapper, and there just became a pattern on the left side where I think it was Ben Davis, who was left centre-back, basically had an open spot when Udogie would push on and push inside to go all the way into Son, into feet. He could attack 1v1, Udogie would underlap. Didn't quite lead to any sort of big moments, but constantly, of course, you've got a full-back underlapping, going to take a defender away. You've kept Son 1v1, you've given him a player to support, you can make a 2v2. But on the right-hand side, it just didn't quite work as well between Emerson and Kulusevski, partly because I think Emerson's, got 3 lungs. I think he can run for miles, but when he was actually getting on the ball quite a bit in the final third, he just seemed a bit panicked that he evidently didn't seem to be used to playing in these spaces. I don't think he's as technically proficient as some of the other players in the Spurs squad, but then it got to the point of the system's really good, you're getting players into space in areas, but you go, do you want your right back on the ball on the edge of the box? Because then you get, okay, it's really good, and that might be a repeatable pattern, but if your right back's on the ball on the edge of the box and then they can't cross from there or they can't shoot, the system's working, but is it working as well as it could do, as well as you need it to? And it's a case of where I think we often look at systems in broad terms, and players, each person is worth one. They are a 1 in a back 3 or 1 in a midfield 4 in a midfield box. And that is true largely because players are all at a very high standard now where teams will leave people 1v1, but players have also got very specific set attributes that they are really good at. Trent is a prime example of that. There's a reason why he hasn't moved inside just to pin someone. It's because he is a really good passer. And I'm intrigued now as more sort of coaches try it. I wonder if we just had a small generation of fullbacks that have seen people crossing and being creative all the time from wide, suddenly everyone goes, oh no, we want you to play inside now. And you go, well, what have my last 5-10 years of development just been for? Where I've just seen the rise of the overlapping fullback and everything. So it's that part. I'm intrigued for the next few seasons how that will shape up from a defender's perspective.
Yeah, it's interesting hearing you talking about underlapping fullbacks as well, because I think people use the term inversion of fullbacks just way too generally. I think we need a better vocabulary of words to explain what roles fullbacks are playing when they come inside, because I think there's a big difference between, for example, what Zinchenko is doing for Arsenal and for example, what you've mentioned, Destiny Udogie, what he's doing for Spurs is very different as well, because the overall tactical picture changes. But we're at risk of just spending this whole podcast talking simply about inverting fullbacks. So I want to talk quickly just about a few of the different approaches that have emerged, I think, particularly, not in this season, but they've become talked about this season, different ways of forming a box midfield. So we've talked about inverting fullbacks, which has been the standard way. But what we saw this season actually with Manchester City was quite interesting, because we saw 2 things. I'll lump these 2 together. One of them was the John Stones position, which was John Stones starting as a centre-back and then pushing forward into the pivot. So rather than being an inverting full-back, he was more of I guess you could call it an inverting centre-back, although that word has a different meaning, going back to Chris Wilder. But the idea then that you're, rather than having your full-back push out, your centre-back is going to push up. And I guess the big change there is that it changes the angles defensively. So if you have a fullback pushing forward into the pivot in defensive transition, they're going to be dropping out in a diagonal movement, often against the way that the ball will be coming through the opposition. With a centre back doing that, you've got a little bit more of a straight line retreat back to your defensive position. Do you have any thoughts on that? Do you think that's just a natural reality that in defensive moments you want the shortest, the path of least resistance back to your defensive position? And is that why that emerged? Or was it, again, I mean, Pep Guardiola had John Stones. If you have a player like John Stones who can play that kind of role, then it makes it a lot easier to do as well.
Yeah, I mean, let's not forget he tried Rico Lewis there, didn't he, in terms of a fullback coming inside, and Bernardo as well for a couple of games, including, I think, was it Arsenal away in the win there? So clearly something he's tried over a period of time, and I think there were some good quotes from a few years back where he said John Stones could play midfield if he wants to. He's excellent. I think it's maybe also an interesting thing in terms of cover, that if you've got a fullback coming inside, obviously you just leave a big gaping hole on sort of one side of the pitch, which maybe is a bit too enticing in terms of, leaving a spot to play into. You're kind of baiting that first pass into that zone. And of course, with a team, if you've got your right back going inside, if they've got a good left winger, they will exploit that, or they'll find a way, or they'll set a plan to try and do that. I think if you at least take the centre back out, you've got cover of another centre back from stepping forward. You've also got, particularly someone like Edison at City, you've got a keeper that can probably come out and sweep and can fill that void. So I guess you can maintain sort of the balance that way. But as you say, defensively, one of the principles of sort of cover and balance, and your recovery runs are straight lines, recover to goal as quickly as possible, and I think it makes more sense because you then got a defender covering the centre of the goal rather than sort of leaving that wide space exposed.
Yeah, and then I've got a second moment last season which I've called the John Stones 2.0 position, because what we've talked about already is John Stones starting as a centre back in build up and pushing forward in the second phase of that build up moment to become a pivot player. Because you then start off with effectively a back four, gives you extra players in that first line. Then when you've moved forward, you can then get John Stones moving into that more advanced position. But what we started seeing by the end of the season was John Stones just starting out as a pivot. So Man City building up out of a 3-2 shape, but having the opportunity for Edison to form part of that chain at the back as well, so that they were essentially starting with a back four and then a double pivot in that first phase of build up, which I think was interesting as well. They didn't even see the need to actually have that safety buffer in the first phase. They just went straight to it, to the second phase shape in the first phase, if that makes sense. So and I think that was really interesting to see as well. Do you have any thoughts on that, why they went that way?
I guess it's a case of trying to produce overloads further up the pitch, as we were sort of saying, I think, before we started recording, that when you can bring the goalkeeper into the build-up play, and particularly when you've got a keeper that's got such effective long distribution, that teams will press outfield with 10. Keepers not yet anyway are not part of the press. So if you can bring your goalkeeper into it, you're going to have a spare player somewhere regardless, or there'll be space that you can create as a result of that. So it's of course also very opposition dependent. That I think it depends often whether you've got a mid-block or sort of a real high press that you're facing, whether teams are going so sort of man for man, or sort of leaving the goalkeeper to be in possession. So I think they'll massively adapt it based on that. And it's just a case of systems being refined across the course of a season. I think that's what can really help when you look back at things over a period, because at times in the season we get very caught up with there's this new thing, this player's changing, you tried this tactic, and you can sort of look back and evaluate. Not a case of turning points or this is where they won or lost the season, quote unquote, but a case of going, this, City often come into form at the end of the season. The season it might have been because they made these tweaks to the system. I think it wasn't until their 1-0 defeat at Anfield in, maybe was it November or late October, where I think they first tried the 3-box-3, but they had, I think Foden was left wing back in that game, and maybe Kyle Walker was right wing back. And you look at the personnel between the first time they tried it in that game and towards the end of the season, and so many of them are completely different. In fact, I think it was João Cancelo at right wing back, because obviously, of course, he then left on loan in January, and it was these things take so much time, even in a condensed season, to try and sort of bring them all together. And
I guess one of the results of having one of your backline invert in some way is that you end up with a back three. And I think what we saw in the course of this season was, again, Pep Guardiola moving to a system where he was using essentially just big defensive players in those outside centre-back positions in the back three that emerges from your inversion. And so we've seen Manuel Akanji being played there, we've seen Nathan Ake being played there, we've seen Kyle Walker being played there. And I think that's been a really interesting thing, especially because we've seen Manchester City now by Josko Gvardiol from RB Leipzig, who's probably one of the best sorts of these kinds of players now, who can play as outside centre-backs or full-backs. So the term that is often given to those is elbow back. So the ability of a player, I guess the shape of an elbow is 90-degree angle. The ability of those players to either come inside or push forward as almost as a fullback correlate. And I guess the part of the reason for that is because when you do invert a player from your back line, you are narrowing the play. Your build-up unit is going to be much narrower, and as you've said, there is the ability to exploit that if the opposition is able to turn over the ball. So you want to have those good 1v1 defenders in those wide areas. So again, Liverpool's a good example of that. We've seen lots of narratives about Trent Alexander-Arnold not being good enough defending in certain transitional moments from that wide position. Now Liverpool have been moving him inside so he can cover in the central spaces, but it means that someone like Ibrahima Konate can sit on that wide area and offers a lot more, physical prowess in those sorts of wide cover areas. And also I think like the angles, again, to talk about the defensive angles, change, right? When the difference between, a fullback trying to go back into the position they were originally in from a central position when the opposition are coming down the wing is very different to an outside centre-back stepping forward on the angle into the on-rushing player as well. So do you think that's something that we're going to start seeing now? We're going to start seeing a lot of centre-backs being used as full-backs because eventually at some point they will become outside centre-backs once the in-possession shape changes.
Yeah, quite possibly. I think it feels like it's an exploitable thing from an attacking perspective as well. I was noted in the Community Shield that Havertz, who was leading the Arsenal press in the first half, trying to cut off the one to Stones first, which again might be a case of let's try and not get the ball to their best build-up player, but also let's force them down the left. And there were a couple of times I think where Saka sort of got at Akanji out wide in the first half, and it's maybe even just a perception bias thing of seeing a big person that we know as a centre-back sort of being a physical presence going, oh yeah, a winger can run at them, a winger can sort of do them damage, but it reminded me similarly, this is more in possession, but at the World Cup that teams sort of did that, a lot of teams did that quite effectively with their fullbacks of playing sort of one more attack-minded fullback, one more defensive and effectively in attack, pushing that fullback really high and wide. I'm thinking of France as a prime example with Theo Hernandez. Effectively at times playing on the last line and then tucking the right back in and forming a back through that way. And I think just at times when you can be asymmetrical could be really awkward to defend against, because naturally defending, particularly when it becomes zonal and in an organised block, is a case of like having balance, your distance between your units, your relationship between the players there and the lines. And suddenly when on one side they've got a really different problem to the other side, you're kind of then like, how do we defend this in an organised, balanced manner? I think it just adds in a bit more chaos and unpredictability that way.
Well, we spent a lot of time talking about that trend last season. Let's start thinking a little bit about how we're going to see responses to that trend coming up. So I've got two ideas that I've thrown in here. We've already mentioned the narrowness. You've been talking about it a little bit there. Mm-hmm. Do you expect to see teams trying to exploit the narrowness that emerges when you're making your build-up unit a lot more central? And why do you think we haven't seen much of that happening so far? I guess there's a reason why the trend has gone that way, because no one's found a solution to it yet. But do you think that we're going to see teams trying to exploit that narrowness going forward?
Yeah, I think so. I think it also is probably quite awkward to try and exploit compared to sort of other setups, because you look at where the bodies are congested sort of in the central area of the pitch, that if you want to do a ball orientated press and press with more defenders than they've got sort of in the final third, that you're either then going to leave them +1 in midfield or sort of on the last line of defence, which I think teams just fundamentally don't want. It's a case of where will you have risk or reward, and I guess teams would rather sort of press 2v3 in that first line and be more content with that, because you go, oh, well, okay, at least if they keep it there, then it's fine. It's in their defensive third. It's on the halfway line. It's not close to our goal or further outfield. So, I think it's hard to press effectively against that sort of shape, particularly when teams want to go man for man now, and particularly because obviously it's a system that's so built around rotations that players can just start moving to drag people out of the way. There's a really, really good example, I think, in the Italian Cup final between Fiorentina and Inter, where Fiorentina pressed Inter really high. And of course, this is a slightly different shape. It's more of a 3-5-2 than a box. But there became a point where, like, the number 9 was just really deep towards his own goal and it pulled a centre-back high. And of course, the system doesn't necessarily matter in that regard, but there were just players scattered all over the pitch that weren't in their normal zones, because they're just going to track and they're going to follow. So I wonder whether teams sort of maybe go more zonally against sort of these sorts of operation or these schemes of play, and just sort of see, okay, what happens if we do let him go inside and not pull that winger out? And it's just awkward to set traps against in that regard.
Yeah, and I think as well the Manchester City goal in the Community Shield came in the second half when Manchester City were much more adept, I think, at manipulating the Arsenal press. So they generated a lot more space. They isolated Thomas Partey, got the ball into Phil Foden, who was then able to turn Partey, in part because Partey had to step forward at speed to try and stop that ball being played, and that makes them less stable. And then once you've done that, once you've got through that first line of the first few lines of the Arsenal press, where they are going quite player for player, that you're then sort of 4v4 against their back line, right? So I think that's something we'll see more and more. And I guess that brings me on to another aspect where I can see some way of being able to exploit these box midfields, and one of them is exploiting transitional moments. What I mean by that is, we've already talked about this a lot, that with all of these box midfields, you're either moving a player into another position in possession in order to form your box midfield, or you do what City were doing at the end of the season last season, which was starting out with a box midfield but then having one of the players move into a different position in the defensive moments. And I think what we're going to start seeing more and more, and this will be actually a theme that we talk about a few times today, is teams recognizing what these transitional routes and moments look like, and then trying to actually force teams to be in these transitional moments and then try and exploit them, if that makes sense. So recognizing, as we've already said, for example, a fullback, if you're inverting your fullback, then there's going to be situations in defensive transition where that fullback has to go out wide. Can you force those turnovers in certain areas that can cause problems for them? Can you have prescribed routes when you've turned the ball over where you can try and move the ball into those areas as quickly as possible, etc. I think that's the sort of thing we're going to start seeing. There's going to be teams actually recognizing that the space, the movement between one position to another, those are the spaces and the moments when you can actually cause teams problems.
Completely. It's something we actually saw across the board sort of last season as, I think, the start of what I expect to see a form of re-rise in this in terms of counter-attack goals. The Opta definition for this has been tweaked a bit over the past few years, but their sort of fast break definition that they now use has been in place since 2018-19. And last season we had 87 counter-attack goals. Now going back in the 4 seasons preceding that for the same definition, it was 54, 56, 76 and 68. So we had a massive sort of spike. It was also the second most counter-attack expected goals that we had in terms of shots. So I was really amazed to see, and I think a lot of us instantly sort of tied it to World Cup stuff, reduced sort of time on the training ground and just what felt like a generally quite chaotic Premier League season. But sort of going back through it, I was amazed to see that Liverpool, United, Spurs were all up there in terms of counter-attack goals. City had their best counter-attacking season in the Premier League, I believe, under Guardiola so far. And it's interesting that this was a style that I think has always been seen as it's what inferior teams had to do because they didn't have another way of attacking. They couldn't control the ball. It was always a reactive moment. But now I think that you've got, particularly as a result of a lot of top teams having those inverted wingers that are quick players, are direct players that can attack individually, are good goal scorers, having goalkeepers that can launch a ball, quite a long way in transition. And I think generally we'll come on to this sort of more often, that the rise of possession, and I know we're going to touch on pressing later, but both of those things becoming homogenous things down the Premier League that almost everyone, not quite everyone, there's always the outliers, which I think are fantastic teams that just don't really care for the way the grain's going, but more teams want possession, which means there's more opportunity to counter-attack, and more teams want to press, which means obviously there's then more different ways you can find solutions in terms of build-up. So completely, I think it amazed me that counter-attacks are sort of coming back up in that regard. I wonder if it's going to be tied to sort of a number 9 coming more back into the fold of more top teams wanting that player that can either run in behind or just be a less of a high-touch player and more someone that's going to do more of their damage towards the edge of the box. So I think there's sort of a few different offshoots all sort of happening at the same time that are just these new sort of germinating things. It feels like we're out of that sort of early Pep sort of era, early sort of Klopp era of like pressing becoming sort of fashionable. Was like, these aren't just fashionable anymore as concepts. There's now details to it, and it's more going through evolutions and different variations.
And so what we're talking about, I think, overall here is the rise of the long ball again. But, and I think you've alluded to it there already, that there's I think a pejorative sense with long ball football, right? Which is, in the past, teams did that because they didn't have the technical quality to do anything else. And I think what we're going to start seeing now is that we're going to see very, very technical approaches to long ball football, which recognise. So we've talked about box midfields, and there's transitional moments between your defensive structure and your attacking structure that can be exploited, and that's, I think, true in every area. And I think maybe the most interesting area is you mentioned there again, the rise of pressing, because what we've seen happening now is that, as you've said, most teams are going to try and press high in in the opposition's build-up phase because they want to destabilise the opposition. But that comes at a cost, which is you leave yourself exposed at the back. And so what we're seeing is the rise of these hybrid pressing approaches, which is in certain phases you're going to go high, you're going to go player for player to try and cause as much problem for the opposition. But as soon as that press gets broken, you then have these exit strategies to get back into a lower zonal structure as well. That's another transitional moment, right? Transitioning between your high press and your defensive zonal structure. And again, I think those are going to be the sorts of situations that teams are going to start exploiting a little bit more. So Brighton is the team that you support, and we've seen examples of them actually doing some good stuff in pre-season. They played against Brentford, I believe it was, and I thought actually Brentford's high press on Brighton was brilliant in that game. And that's the thing everyone likes to talk about. Everyone likes to talk about Brighton's build-up, and there's the famous Roberto De Zerbi quotes where he says, "I don't like to go long ball because it's like a loss of control." But what we've started seeing from Brighton now is them recognising that teams are going to have solutions to their build-up, their deep build-up, and so they're developing these solutions they can have by just bypassing the press, going long and being able to exploit weaknesses in the opposition's shape. And I think that's what it comes down to, right? It's that this is not just yeet ball for yeet ball's sake. This is actually the opportunity cost has changed because of the way that teams are pressing, that it's now much better for us to go long and try and force these sorts of chances. And I think Simon Adingra scored a goal from one of those situations, right?
Yeah, and it's quite funny because it's an almost identical pattern of goal to what Karim Matoma scored in the 3-3 draw against Brentford at the Amex, which was in April, and of course this was only a few months later. And again, when we're sort of talking about players and exploiting the attributes that these players have, one of the ways we didn't talk about forming a box midfield actually that Brighton had done was they'd sort of have the number 9 would drop deeper in build-up and effectively sort of be on the same sort of the same vertical line as one of the central midfielders, and would try to sort of pull wide and receive if they could go into the pivot to play into the number 9. So you'd basically have the two full-backs would be more advanced. You'd have the two centre-backs split deep between the goalkeeper. The double pivot would be, let's say, edge of the box. Number 9 would not be on, say, the halfway line, pinning a defender. They'd be dropping deep. And your two most advanced players would be the two wingers, and they would be generally out on the touchline, but these are two inverted wingers. And the pitch you then end up with, and the way that Brentford were pressing was man for man, as you say, was really good. And I think actually, particularly in the April game between Brighton and Brentford, they pressed them really well at the start, and they made errors, and Brentford, I think, led twice in the game, or led 3 times in the game. But they were leaving a 2v2 at the back because their centre-backs were stepping up with sort of the number 9, and often the number 9 will make, as Jason Steele sort of got his soul on the ball and he's rolling it out towards the edge of the box, and sort of the press is sort of still waiting for the moment to jump or waiting for something to happen, and still just taking a couple yards. The number 9 will then sprint sort of back in, really dropping deep towards their own goal. I don't know whether they're actually genuinely trying to receive the ball or whether this is just purely to pull a defender high. But then it opens up the fact you've got a 1v1 between a winger and a fullback, and if it's Karim Matoma or Simon Adingra who have got most people for pace, you can then play that clipped on in behind. And I guess as well, often the way that fullbacks are taught to shape their body is you're probably going to try and mirror the winger. So if the winger is facing the goal, you're actually facing the winger with your back to your own goal, ideally with your feet that are matching, that are in line with that winger, so that you can basically just mirror them and follow their run. And of course, if that then goes over the top of you and goes inside you and behind your back, you've suddenly got to spin your hips, and then you're either going to lose sight of where the ball is or you lose sight of where the player is, and it must just be massively discombobulating, because especially someone like Karim Matoma who's got such a fast sort of sprinting start, you lose that half second, suddenly you're on the back foot, and then there's a chance to score on there. I think it's really, really fascinating. It's obviously something City have massively in their locker as well. I think Arsenal do anyway with Ramsdale, could even more so with David Raya. And it will make sense because teams are getting better at pressing. Top teams are getting really, really good. And I'll quickly just go through some of the numbers that last season there were just over 2,600 high turnovers in the Premier League, which is across all the teams, which is a 25% rise from 2018-19. So just sort of 4 or 5 seasons ago, which was just over 2,100. So you're seeing hundreds of more high turnovers, which I guess across the full season might only be sort of 1, 2 or 3 a game, but it's notable that we can see how high these teams are pressing now.
Yeah, and I think the thing to note here is that part of the reason for this is that because teams are playing these hybrid structures, they have to have these really, I think, mechanical routes in order to move into the high press and then drop back into the lower block. And I think those routes are repetitive and therefore are manipulable, right? So again, we talked already about the Community Shield with actually what Manchester City were able to do in the second half was manipulate the fact that Partey is, one, trying to add extra cover in front of the back line, but also in certain situations he has to step up to make sure there isn't a free player. And what City were doing was manipulating it so he had to step up. And then in those moments, you then know there's going to be a lot of space in between the line of the pressing unit, but then the back line, and they were trying to find those situations as well. So again, I want to reiterate that I think so much of this stuff that's happening, despite the fact we're going to call it long ball or transitional football, is based around the idea that actually you're generating space to exploit, and that makes it it's a lower risk way of playing because you are changing the odds in your favour as well. So I think that's definitely something to look out for next season. One final tactical idea, I think, before we move quickly on to talk about some of the teams we're looking forward to talk about to watch next season. But we need to talk a little bit about position versus relation. So Abhishek Raj on Twitter said, can we talk about Fluminense and the impact of relationism-based approaches in the European game, especially in the Premier League? We've seen Erik ten Hag introduce elements of it at Manchester United in a system largely anchored in positional play principles. Is this the most likely manifestation? Now, I think we need to talk about the basics of the differences between relation and position, but do you want to talk to us about that?
I think you're more qualified than I to discuss that.
Well, I don't want to get too much into the weeds, but essentially the argument is that positional play is a style of football that has been developed through various routes. I think most people would say starting with total football in the Netherlands. So Rinus Michels, Johan Cruyff, and then we're talking about Pep Guardiola at Barcelona. And the idea there, I think, is that what you're doing is you're using positional and structural ideas in order to exploit space, in order to be able to give your players time and space on the ball. And I think this is very different from what had gone before, because what was going on before was a lot more, I guess, individualist based. So it's this idea that you want to get your best players into certain situations where they're able to work off their teammates, and you make the most of the fact that your most talented individuals, if you can get them into those sorts of relationships with their talented teammates, then you're going to get a huge amount of upside there. And I think that there's the argument generally is that football has become quite stale because of this positional approach, because Pep Guardiola did it, and I think a lot of people just assume as a result of that, therefore this is the only way you can play football. And what we're seeing now is a rise of, I think, maybe a bit of a pushback, which is rather than saying, you need to. The big thing with positional play that often people talk about is, the rational occupation of space, making sure that you're spreading your players across the pitch in certain areas. We've talked about pinning already, right? Which is like we've talked about it particularly in terms of making the build-up structures of narrow, so that the opposition become narrow and it gives you better access into wide areas. But then there's the other concept of pinning, which is using your wide players to be touchline hugging wingers, for example. That spreads out the back line. It creates space for you to be able to manipulate. And the whole idea, I think, behind positional play is to manipulate space in order to be able to move the ball through lines of pressure that the opposition are trying to stop you from getting the ball through, in order to generate chances. But now what we're seeing, particularly with Fernando Diniz, who's the coach of Fluminense, is this approach.
And Brazil now, right, as well?
Yeah, and there's a few people here and there who are talked about a lot. The coach of Malmo as well is a guy who's using those sorts of ideas in Europe. But the idea with them, and what you'll see a lot of these relational fans talking about, is it's doing things that look unusual to, I think, fans of usually European football. It's getting players into close proximity. It's about getting them to play these 1-2 passes and move the ball through pressure, through, I guess, individual moments as much as anything. That's not to say there's no structure there, there's no planning there. I think there is, and obviously a lot of these players work very hard at being able to play in those kinds of ways. And I guess Abhishek's question is, are we going to start seeing some of these more relational ideas, so overloading in certain situations, playing 1-2s, being able to work opposition back lines through I guess just innate skill, rather than just let's try and make the tactics generate those chances as well. So yeah, what's your thoughts on all of this?
I mean, I think someone who's always grown up consuming primarily European football, it's really refreshing to see as a different way. Of course, you say it's more about the playing relationships. It feels just more like relational football being, and again, these aren't like binaries, these are things that exist somewhere on a continuum, with these being sort of end points. It's more about players having the freedom to try and solve the problems themselves, rather than a coach saying, here's our tactical plan. Of course, I don't assume Pep Guardiola doesn't ever listen to his players, but I imagine he's saying, look, we want to play in this certain way. Just sort of removing the coach or the manager as like the bearer of all the knowledge in the situation, and sort of empowering the players more. I think it largely makes sense, especially, or elements of it make sense. I think Real Madrid are a really good sort of halfway house between that. I was thinking particularly of their, would have been their second leg against Chelsea in the Champions League last season, where some of the link-up play between Vinicius, it was Rodrigo and Benzema, sort of all overloading on the same side of the pitch, connecting together. It can be really hard to defend against, in the sense that your left back doesn't want to come across all the way to the right hand side of the pitch, because they do that, space opens up in their sort of zone, and that it completely exploits any form of zonal marking, and can also exploit man marking, because obviously you're then dragging players. So it would require a really sophisticated, a relational style of actually defending, because I don't think we do relational defending at all, because of course we think that would just be pure chaos if we can try and figure it out between us. Fluminense, as you say, a really interesting team to watch. I've watched a few of their games and some of their clips, and it's also really valuable, I think, of anyone that's grown up like I have, primarily watching European football, because it requires a lot of active cognitive dissonance to try and see it and go, this looks like everything I've been told doesn't work at elite level or shouldn't work at top level. And of course it does, because these are players that work particularly well together and have established sort of playing relationships. And it makes sense now, I think, particularly as the technical quality of football has got higher and the game's got faster, and players can, solve things better on their own. And particularly with wingers, I think inverted wingers are often number 9, who presumably do a lot of their play anyway, sort of on their own, and are good at sort of connecting in that way. A winger naturally can connect with a fullback on the overlap. That's sort of an established thing in positional play, right? If inverted winger comes inside, fullback overlaps. So that's not really any different to left winger and right winger playing a 1-2. It's just the position, if you want to call it that, has changed on the pitch of how we're sort of perceiving it.
Yeah, and there still are structures in relational play as well. So one of the concepts that's often talked about is the concept of the escadinha, which is, I guess, staircase in Portuguese. And that's this concept of getting players on the same diagonal lines, so that you can emphasize those relations between the players that you have, and be able to move the ball in that kind of way as well. So yeah, I think this is really interesting. It's worth saying that as well. You've already mentioned that there's a spectrum here. For example, I think overload to isolate is a concept that is talked about in positional play a lot, and that's this idea that you overload all of your players on one side to generate superiority, either qualitative or numerical in another part of the pitch. Now that's very positional vocabulary there, but again, what you're talking about there is, if you get a lot of players around the ball, you can keep the ball better, you can drag opposition players out of the way, and use that as a way of exploiting opposition structures as well. But I think we are going to start seeing, more of this stuff happening, especially because, as you've mentioned, Real Madrid are a pretty good halfway house between, a really overly structured approach with top down. I guess it's a nice way of thinking about it in terms of top down, which is maybe the manager imposing their ideas on the player, and then bottom up, which is the manager allowing players to solve problems on the pitch as well. Right. Let's talk a little bit then. We've talked for so long about all of this stuff, and I've had a great time. But we were going to talk a little bit about some of the teams that you are looking forward to watching next season. You have written a piece called Tactics to Look Out For this season, Anti-Positional Football, which is what we've just been talking about, Xabi Alonso and Middlesbrough. I think maybe what we should do is just both pick maybe one or two teams that we're actually kind of interested in watching from a tactical point of view next season. So who would you like to kick off with?
I think Lens were one of the teams that stood out for me, wanting to sort of make that piece in the first place. And as I said in the piece, it's not an exhaustive list. This is purely some teams that I thought were cool. And I think one of the best things about sort of the platform that I've got now, and of course the stuff that you do on Twitter as well, is that people are really good at sharing ideas of this team is cool. There's been teams that I've seen recommended all the way in sort of South Africa. There's I think the Sundowns there with some of their pressing
Coach
and stuff.
Rulani.
So there you go. But the fact that all this is sort of accessible now is really, really cool. But Lens, I just thought were great, because obviously everyone's got quite fed up with PSG just sort of dominating Liga. They played a really, really nice, John and I often get into sort of discussions. It's going to sound like disagreements, but it's not, in that I think I tend to quite enjoy quite effective defensive football, not in the sense of like a low block but just teams that are good at effectively keeping clean sheets and minimising the goals that they concede.
You're a Brighton fan who's disappointed with Roberto De Zerbi's lack of clean sheets.
Clean sheets are always a nice bonus. I don't know. Maybe it's the English side of the game coming out at me, liking the defending. But no, Lens were exceptional last season. Their home record was incredible. They won, I think it was 17 of 19 games at home. They had the fewest goals conceded, just 29 in their league games, 15 clean sheets, and lost just 4 games. They attacked in a really nice 3-4-3, defended in a 5-4-1. Of course, the elephants in the room with that team are Fofana and Openda, who have both left, but there's a really fair point that they had Arnaud Kalimuendo, I think, a couple seasons back. And they also had Jonathan Klaus, who was their top assister in that season, and they sold both of them. Kalimuendo was on loan and left, and then they brought in Openda, and of course then they brought through Fofana, and then came second. So it's like, this is a team that are used to sort of selling players. But they finished second. They're in the Champions League next season. They're really good at attacking through wide areas. They press really high as well. Really nice sort of out of possession team. And they can be a really good transitional counter-attack team when they need to as well. So they're kind of a bit of everything. And they've not got sort of one set way of playing. And of course, that's why they're able to win so many games, so they can find solutions. But I thought they were exciting, and their home record is so good, it makes them exciting. I think it's in particular to watch in the Champions League, where they're there, I think, for the first time since 2002, 2003. So that I'm sure will be incredible.
Yeah, Ligue 1, an interesting league. I think that we're seeing a lot more tactical coaches move there, so I'm quite excited to see Francesco Farioli, who's just gone to Nice. He'll be fun to watch. He was the goalkeeper coach, I believe, under Roberto De Zerbi, and then went into coaching. So lots of De Zerbian ideas there as well. So maybe they're one to keep an eye on in Ligue 1. I'm going to go to the Premier League because, which sounds boring, right? Because we all know what's going on in the Premier League. But I need to talk about Andoni Iraola, who was recently the Rayo Vallecano manager in La Liga, has moved to Bournemouth, and I think he will be one of the fun coaches to watch this season, because I think what you tend to see particularly in the Premier League, is you get elite football where they're playing a very specific sort of possession-based style of play, and then you have everyone else at the bottom battling it out, and a lot of the time the emphasis is on being defensively stolid and making sure that you're not giving away too much, trying to hit on the break. And I think, Iraola is still within that kind of genre of football club. Football team, but what's so interesting about him is that he is using a lot of the hybrid pressing that we talked about earlier, which is being able to destabilize oppositions in their build-up phase, and then drop back into those low blocks without having to give up too much of a risk at the back. And I think that's going to be really fascinating watching in the Premier League, because I guess the idea is that you have a really intelligent out of possession approach, and then you have what's really interesting for me is how he then has solutions once you've turned the ball over. This is how we attack. Very very sort of transitional football, but with a very smart out of possession approach. And I'm kind of interested to see how that goes, particularly because we've already seen Jesse Marsch last season at Leeds United. The big questions there about whether or not you can approach the Premier League with the out of possession side of the game being your main upside. Obviously with Jesse Marsch it's a very different type of out of possession approach, and so I'm kind of interested to see whether or not Bournemouth rise or fall on the basis of their intelligent approach. So that's my tip for a team who will be interesting to watch in the Premier League. Do you have any Premier League team that you're particularly interested in from a tactical point of view? Bournemouth
is one that I think a lot of people have been mentioning, that I'm really intrigued to see based on their signings as well that they've brought in. They had a really good January window, I think, particularly Dango Ouattara, who was excellent second half of the season. And again, it's one of those sort of direct wingers that will exploit teams when fullbacks do sort of play inside. And a couple of their signings, Alex Scott, of course, has been on the lips of everyone, I think, for the past few seasons from Bristol City. But Milos Kerkez is a really, really good young left-back coming out of the Alkmaar Academy. The AZ Academy, I should say. Again, another fullback that can play inside, can be creative. It's really, really, really nice. Max Aarons bringing him from Norwich, and they've got, I think, 5-6 signings. They've spent a bit of money in places, but so be it. All under the age of 24. Hamid Traoré is another one from Sassuolo. Roma Favre as well from Lyon. So, they've really sort of stacked up and really sort of built upon that, which I guess is exactly what Scott Parker presumably was asking for this time last year, or was told in no uncertain terms wasn't there. And Justin Kluivert as well, shouldn't forget. So there's obviously parts that need to fit in and need to evolve a squad. But I haven't seen too much of Iraola or his teams previously, so I'm very much looking to enjoy that and just.
There isn't going to be many clean sheets, let me tell you, so you might not enjoy it that much. But yeah, interesting that you mentioned Milos Kerkez there, because he was playing for AZ Alkmaar, as you mentioned, and they were a team that you had as well as a fun team to watch as well. But did you want to add anyone else to the list of teams that you're excited about watching next season? I
think Middlesbrough were a fun one. They were Championship playoff semi-final losers last season at home to Coventry, but they were previously managed by Chris Wilder, and I think were in sort of the bottom 5 or 6 sort of when he left, and Michael Carrick there has done an exceptional job. Seems to be another one adding to that trend of sort of central midfielders coming through and becoming coaches, but actually they were attacking similarly to what we were saying before in terms of sort of elbow backs or having that asymmetric approach of, admittedly it was Ryan Giles who has now just gone to Luton as a really, really good creative left back that would push on, and their right back would tuck round, so they'd effectively turn what looks like a 4-3-1 on paper to almost like a 3-4-3, and Chuba from up top, who Arsenal fans will know of, Brighton fans will know of from Alone. I think he was at Hull as well. He'd been around a bit and just hadn't really taken off, having had a good youth career, and then went and scored, I think it was almost 30 goals last season, and really really took off there. So I think they might be an interesting team, as someone that would, hadn't even had a full season there, for what they might push on and do next season. And it's just good because the Championship, I think, is notoriously a hard league to do that and then to be tactical, because it just has its ways of working and everything that comes with it. So I think they'll be good fun to watch next season.
Yeah, there's a few things here. I guess one, you mentioned Michael Carrick. There's also Kieran McKenna, who's gone through the Manchester United School of Coaching. He's at Ipswich this season in the Championship, so it'll be fascinating to see how he does. He's playing some fun stuff as well. But also, yeah, as you've mentioned, like what we're seeing in the Championship now is a lot of coaches trying to play, elite possessional football in that league. So I'm thinking, Russell Martin, who's the sort of ultra build-up, one of the ultra build-up coaches. You've got Daniel Farker at Leeds as well, who will be doing, he's inverting fullbacks and doing a lot of first phase, second phase stuff. Question always being, what do these guys do in the third phase when they're actually attacking in the final third? So interesting stuff there. But then again, Maresca at Leicester as well, who's come through the Pep Guardiola Academy of coaching. And I suppose the big question for me is, how functional is that going to be? How functional is it going to be to try and play that kind of positionally aware football in the Championship, where you're often going to be coming up against teams who are going to stodge, try and hit you on the break, and you can have, we've seen it with Russell Martin for a few seasons now, right? You have 70% possession, pushing like 80% possession, and you can still lose games as well. So any thoughts on that?
No, I think it just sort of shows where English football has come in sort of a few generations, or not even a few generations, sorry, but in a few decades really, that it's something that obviously ties in nicely to the EPP and what's gone on with the national teams across all the age groups and men's and women's game as well. So I wonder if it's just sort of almost an overcorrection sort of thing of like, there's certain coaches or certain styles of play that want what I might say at times is sort of too much possession, or it can just be, or viewed that in the wrong sense, sorry, of like, it's not worth possession to attack, it can be defensive possession, and it might just be a case of like, if we can control the ball for 80% of the time, well, that's 20% where